The snow had been falling for 3 days straight when Elias Colt found the woman kneeling in it, her bare hands pressed flat against a mound of frozen earth, her lips the color of a winter sky just before dark. He almost missed her entirely. The pines along the upper ridge of the Bitterroot Mountains had bent so low under the weight of the early November snowfall of 1874 that the trail had all but disappeared, and Elias had been navigating by memory and instinct the way he always did when the world turned white and silent, and every familiar landmark became a ghost of itself. He had been pushing his mule, a broad-shouldered gray animal named Boone, through drifts that reached the creature's chest in some places, hauling a loaded pack of beaver pelts and dried elk meat back toward the small valley settlement of Harlow Creek, where he wintered each year when the high country became genuinely dangerous, even for a man like him. He saw her first as a shape that did not belong, a dark figure against the white, hunched and still in a way that living things rarely were. His hand went automatically to the rifle resting across his saddle horn, because out here in the Bitterroot territory of Montana in the year 1874, an unmoving shape in a snowstorm was more likely to mean trouble than not. But as Boone picked his way closer, picking up his great flat hooves with the deliberate care of a beast that understood the ground beneath him could not be trusted, Elias saw the shape resolve itself into something that seized his chest with a feeling he had not experienced in a very long time. A young woman. No coat worth speaking of, only a thin wool dress gone dark with melted snow, her dark hair plastered against the back of her neck. She was kneeling at a crude wooden cross planted in the earth, the fresh-turned mound still visible beneath the thin sheet of snow that had settled over it, and her hands were flat against the grave marker, fingers splayed, as though she were trying to hold on to whatever was beneath it. She did not look up when Boone snorted and stamped. She did not look up when Elias swung down from the saddle with a creak of cold leather, his boots punching through the snow's crust. She did not look up even when he crouched down to her level and said quietly but firmly, "Ma'am." Her eyes were open, which was the only thing that told him she was still among the living. They were dark eyes, the color of deep water, and they were fixed on the cross with an expression that was not grief exactly, though grief was certainly part of it. It was the expression of a person who has decided that there is nothing left worth turning away for. That look, more than the cold and the snow and the inadequate clothing, was what frightened Elias Colt down to the marrow of his bones. "Ma'am," he said again, and this time he reached out and put one of his large, rough hands against her cheek. The cold of her skin hit him like a blow. She was not merely chilled, she was in the deep stages of it, the kind of cold that crept into the blood and slowed the heart, and made a person feel warm and sleepy and agreeable toward dying. She turned her head then, slowly, as though the effort required tremendous will. Her eyes found his face, and he saw them try to focus, try to make sense of him, this enormous man looming over her in the white silence of the mountains with snow gathering on the shoulders of his elk-hide coat and his dark hair curling against the back of his collar. "I am not leaving him," she said. Her voice was barely a thread of sound, but it carried something in it, some stubborn remnant of a woman who had once been fierce. "You're going to die right here if you don't move," Elias said. He had never been a man who softened hard truths. "I know," she said, and she turned her eyes back to the grave. That one word, spoken without self-pity or drama, with a simple and terrible calm, hit Elias harder than anything had hit him in years. He stayed crouched in the snow for a half-second, long enough to understand exactly what he was dealing with, and then he did the only thing that made any sense to a man built the way he was built, in body and in character. He reached down, and he picked her up. She made a sound of protest, a weak push of her hands against his chest, but he already had her off the ground and against him, and the warmth of his body, even through the elk-hide coat, must have registered because her pushing hands went still almost immediately. He carried her the way a man carries something he is not willing to drop, one arm beneath her knees and one arm around her back, and he got her up onto Boone and kept his arm around her to hold her upright while he led the mule by the reins with his other hand. "The grave will be there when you are warm," he said. "Whoever is in it would not thank you for joining them today." She said nothing. He felt her shivering begin, which he took as a good sign, because shivering meant her body still had the will to fight. He moved as fast as Boone could manage through the snow, taking the lower trail that wound down through the spruce timber toward the valley, the one that was sheltered enough from the wind that the drifts were shallower. And he watched the sky and calculated distance and kept his arm around her the whole way. His cabin was 4 miles from where he had found her. It was a good cabin, built solid over 3 years of labor, with a stone fireplace that took up most of the north wall and a roof of split shingles that he replaced every spring, and walls of notched pine logs chinked with clay and dried grass. It sat at the edge of a narrow meadow where a spring creek ran even in winter, and it was, in Elias Colt's honest opinion, the best place on earth. He had never brought anyone to it, not in the 7 years he had lived in these mountains. He brought her there now without a moment's hesitation. Getting the door open with one arm still around her was a feat that required some creative arrangement, but he managed it and got her inside and set her down in the chair closest to the fireplace, which was banked low with coals still alive beneath the ash. He rebuilt it fast, adding kindling and then split pine, and the fire caught and grew and the cabin began to warm, and he turned from the fireplace to find her staring at it with those dark, unfocused eyes. He stripped his coat and hung it. He put the kettle on the iron hook over the fire. He found the blanket from his bed and put it around her shoulders, and then, because there was no other practical course of action, he took her boots off. They were cheap leather, badly soled, already saturated, and her feet inside them were so cold he could feel it through his own palms. He rubbed them methodically, the way his mother had taught him when he was a boy in Ohio, and one of his brothers had fallen through the creek ice in January. The woman watched him do this with an expression that was hard to read. There was no embarrassment in it, which told him she was still too cold to have room for embarrassment, and no gratitude yet either. Just a quiet, hollow watching. Low. "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated so long he thought she was not going to answer. Then she said, Clara Voss." "Elias Colt," he said. "This is my cabin. You are safe here." "I was not looking to be safe," she said, and there was that thread of fierceness again beneath the hollow exhaustion. "I know," he said, the same plain words he had said to her in the snow. He finished with her feet and moved to her hands, which were red and stiff, the fingers beginning to swell a little at the tips. He rubbed those too. "That does not change the fact that you are here now, and I'm not letting you go back out until you are warm and fed and have slept." She looked at him directly for the first time, really looked, taking him in with those dark eyes. He knew what she was seeing. He was not a small man. He stood well over 6 feet and was built across the chest and shoulders the way men built by mountain work were built, all real weight and no extra, with arms like doubled rope and hands that could grip an axe handle all day without tiring. His face was weathered and angular, a jaw that had not seen a razor in some weeks, dark eyes under a heavy brow. His hair was dark brown and overgrown, touching the back of his collar, and there was a scar along his left jaw from a mishandled trap chain 3 winters back. He was 29 years old, and he had lived alone in the mountains for 7 of those years, and he looked every bit of all of it. "You don't know me," she said. "That's true," he agreed. "Drink this." The kettle was not hot yet, but the water in the tin cup he poured from the cast iron pot on the hearth was warm, and he had put dried yarrow and some of the precious coffee he kept for emergencies into it. She took the cup with both shaking hands and drank, and he watched the color begin, very slowly, to come back to her face. He fed her after that. There was venison stew he had made 2 days back, still good, reheated in the iron pot, and hard cornbread wrapped in a cloth, and she ate it without speaking, with the focused desperation of someone who has not eaten in longer than they are willing to admit. He watched her do it and did not say anything because he understood that some kinds of pain needed to be fed before they could be spoken. When the bowl was empty and the fire was roaring and she had stopped shivering and started simply sitting, still and quiet and wrapped in his blanket, he pulled the second chair up to the other side of the hearth and sat in it and waited. The cabin settled around them with the comfortable sounds of a good fire and wind in the pines outside and the snow whispering against the small window. The light was amber and warm. It was the kind of light that made a person want to tell the truth. "He was my husband," she said at last. "Daniel. He was 24 years old, and he died of a fever 3 days ago, and I buried him myself, because there was no one else. She looked down at the empty bowl in her lap. We came out from Pennsylvania in March. We had a homestead claim up on the East Meadow, 4 miles from here. We built a house, we planted. Everything went wrong. She stopped. He did not rush her. The crop failed in August. We had almost nothing going into autumn. Daniel got the fever in October. I tried everything I knew. It wasn't enough. The flatness of her voice was not the flatness of someone who did not feel these things. It was the flatness of someone who had felt them so completely and so without relief that the feeling had temporarily burned out the ability to express it. "How old are you?" Elias asked. 22, she said. 22 years old and alone in the Bitterroot Mountains in November of 1874 with a dead husband and a failed homestead, and no one within reasonable distance. He looked at the fire and thought about that for a moment. "Is there family somewhere? Back in Pennsylvania?" She shook her head. "My parents are gone. Daniel's family did not approve of the marriage. We came out here partly to get away from their opinion of it." The picture clarified itself in his mind with the completeness of something that had always been inevitable. She had no one. She had come out here with one person, and that person was gone, and she was alone in the worst weather the Bitterroot had seen in several years, with inadequate supplies and inadequate shelter, and a heart that had, quite simply, stopped seeing the point. "You are not going back to that homestead tonight," he said. She looked at him. Something in her eyes sharpened slightly, a return of the fierceness that the cold and the grief had dampened. "You cannot tell me where I will go." "I am not telling you," he said. "I am informing you of a fact. There is a blizzard building. I can feel it in the way the temperature has been dropping for the last 6 hours. If you go back up that mountain tonight in that dress, you will not survive it. That is not a threat. That is simply what will happen." She stared at him. He stared back. He was not a man who blinked first. "There is a second bunk," he said, nodding toward the back wall where he had built 2 sleeping shelves, one above the other, for no reason he had ever been entirely sure of at the time. "I will sleep in the lower one, and you will take the upper, and in the morning when the storm is past, you can do whatever you choose. But tonight you stay." She looked at the bunks. She looked at the fire. She looked at her hands, which had gone from red and swollen to simply pale and a little trembling. "I don't know you," she said again. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, and it came out of him with a gentleness that surprised even him. "I know you don't. And I know that you are sitting in a stranger's cabin in the middle of a Montana blizzard, and that nothing about today has been anything other than terrible. But I'm asking you to trust the simple fact that I built this cabin to be safe and warm, and that you are both those things right now, and that for tonight, that is enough." She was quiet for a very long time. The fire popped and hissed. Outside, the wind had picked up and the snow was beginning to drive hard against the cabin walls with a sound like thrown sand. "All right," she said finally, and then, very quietly, almost inaudibly, "Thank you." He nodded. He got up and took her bowl and poured more stew, and brought it back without asking if she wanted more, because he had watched her eat the first bowl and he knew she did. She took it and ate it, and gradually, over the course of that long evening, the hollow look began to recede from her eyes, not gone, not by any means gone, but pushed back slightly by warmth and food and the simple animal comfort of being somewhere dry and enclosed. He told her about the blizzard of 1872, which had been the worst he had seen in his time in the mountains, and about the spring that followed it, which had been the most beautiful he could remember. And he talked partly because he thought she needed the sound of a human voice, and partly because he was, without being entirely certain when it had happened, reluctant to let the silence fall back over her the way it had been falling when he found her in the snow. She listened with her eyes on the fire, and once she almost smiled, a small, fractured thing at the corner of her mouth, when he described how Boone had gotten into his corn stores the previous summer and consumed approximately half of a winter's worth of dried corn, and then stood in the doorway of the cabin looking profoundly satisfied with himself. He took note of that almost smile, the way a trapper takes note of a fresh track, carefully, with full attention. She slept that night in the upper bunk with 2 of his blankets and his spare wool shirt draped over her, and did not wake until the gray light of a snowbound morning was creeping through the cabin's single window. He was already up, had already rebuilt the fire and put coffee on, and was pulling on his coat to go check on Boone when he heard her stir above him. "The storm passed in the night," he said without turning around. "Temperature is still bitter. You should not try to go anywhere until it warms some." A pause from above. Then, "How do you know the temperature without going out?" "The way the wood sounds when I split it," he said. He pulled the door open, letting in a blast of cold that she flinched from even from across the room, and went out to see to his mule. He took his time with Boone, checking the animal's feet and legs and putting extra hay down and breaking the ice that had formed over the water trough with 3 blows of his axe. The meadow was pristine and blinding white under the new snow, the sky above it clearing to a color of blue so deep it looked almost artificial. The cold was indeed bitter, somewhere well below freezing, the kind of cold that made the inside of the nose ache and turned breath to vapor the instant it left the mouth. When he came back inside, she was sitting at the table in his spare wool shirt, which reached to mid-thigh over her dress, with her hands around a tin cup of coffee she had poured for herself, and she looked at him with an expression that was different from the day before. More present, more aware, still carrying the weight of grief, which she would carry for a long time yet, but no longer quite so entirely consumed by it. "I want to go back to the grave today," she said. He took his coat off and hung it. "I'll take you," he said. She blinked. "You don't have to do that. The snow is deep and the trail is not safe without someone who knows it," he said simply, pouring his own coffee and sitting across from her. "I'll take you." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite decode, something between wariness and something warmer. "You are a very strange man, Elias Colt," she said. "I have been told that," he agreed. They ate breakfast first, oatmeal with dried berries he had picked and preserved in August, and she ate with less desperation and more presence than the night before, and they talked, haltingly at first, then with increasing ease about practical things, about how long the snow was likely to stay, about the state of her cabin and her stores, about what she had and had not managed to lay in before Daniel had fallen ill. The picture that emerged was not a good one. She had limited stores, a cabin that was adequate but not excellent, and no experience wintering alone in the Bitterroot, which was a thing that required specific and hard-won knowledge even for someone in good circumstances. He did not say these things as criticisms. He said them as facts, the way he said everything, and she received them the same way, with a directness that he found, quietly, impressive. They went to the grave mid-morning. He broke trail ahead of her, which with his height and the snowshoes he dug from the corner of the cabin allowed her to follow in his wake without struggling too badly. The temperature had not risen much and the air bit hard at any exposed skin. He had given her his spare wool coat, which was vastly too large and made her look very young and very small, and she had tied it around herself with a length of rope from the pack room. She had her own boots back, dried by the fire overnight, and he had stuffed the toes with raw wool from a bag he kept for fletching purposes to help them fit closer. The grave was undisturbed. The rough wooden cross he had not noticed the name on the day before, read, Daniel Voss, 1850 to 1874, and nothing else, which meant she had made it herself with whatever tools she had, probably a wood-burning iron if she had one. He stood back at a respectful distance while she crouched and put her hand on the mound and talked to her husband in a voice too low for him to hear, and he looked away at the trees and the sky and gave her the privacy of that. When she stood, her face was wet, but she did not hide it, and she did not apologize for it, and he thought again that there was something in her that had not been broken, only bent, though the bending had been severe. "I want to fix the cross," she said. "It came from a branch. I should find something better." "There is good cedar in the woodpile at my place," he said. "I can cut a proper one." She looked at him. "You would do that?" "It is not a large amount of trouble," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and he held hers, and neither of them said anything. And something passed between them in that silent moment that was simply the recognition of two people acknowledging each other's reality fully and without flinching. And it was, he would think later, the moment when everything began. They went back to his cabin, and he cut the cedar that afternoon while she sat inside by the fire, and made herself useful by mending a tear in one of his shirts with a needle and thread she found in his small sewing kit, which he kept because gear needed constant maintenance and he had no one else to keep it for him. He was good with an axe, but cedar was fussy work with a carving knife, and getting the cross properly shaped and smooth took him most of the afternoon. When he came back in with it, she looked at the workmanship and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "It's beautiful." And her voice broke on the last word. He put it against the wall, and she composed herself, and they had supper, which he cooked, more venison and some dried beans and the last of the hard cornbread. They talked while they ate, and this time they did not stay close to practical subjects. She told him about Pennsylvania, about the small town outside of Philadelphia where she had grown up, the daughter of a German immigrant father who had run a dry goods store, and a mother who had taught her to read and cook and do accounts. She told him about how she and Daniel had met at a church social when she was 17 and he was 19, and how they had married when she was 20 and spent 2 years planning the Western venture that had seemed, from the vantage point of Pennsylvania, like the beginning of everything, and had become, from the vantage point of Montana, something so much harder and more treacherous than anything they had imagined. She was not bitter about it. That was what struck him. She talked about the decision with a kind of clear-eyed honesty that did not try to make Daniel into either a villain or a saint, did not make herself into either a fool or a heroine. They had wanted something. They had tried for it. The trying had cost them everything. She held that fact without softening it. He told her in return more about himself than he usually told anyone, partly because she was there, and partly because there was something about her way of listening that made it feel natural to speak. He told her about Ohio, about his family's farm there, and the 4 brothers he had grown up with, and the restlessness that had gotten into him at 21 and never let go. The absolute bone-deep need to get west and get into the mountains and find out what he was made of when there was no one around to cushion the finding out. He told her about his first winter in the Bitterroot, which had nearly killed him twice in ways he had not anticipated, and about the trapper named Old Heck, who had found him half frozen in January of that first year and spent 3 weeks teaching him things that had kept him alive ever since. "He sounds like the kind of man who comes along exactly when you need him," she said. He looked at her across the table. The firelight was orange and warm on her face. She was, he registered with a clarity that he had been somewhat carefully not registering since the previous day. A very striking woman. Not in the fine-boned porcelain way that the society pages back east seemed to favor, but in the real, alive way of a woman who had worked with her hands and faced difficulty and come through it, carrying something intact. Dark eyes and dark hair, and a face with strong, clean lines, and a mouth that was designed for emotion, curved in a way that made it expressive even in repose. "Seems like that kind," he agreed, and looked back at his plate. That night, and the night after, and the night after that, she stayed. Not because he asked her to, but because the temperature remained dangerously low, and the trail between his cabin and the homestead was treacherous, and she had nowhere urgent to be. He was not entirely honest with himself about how much he was not encouraging her to leave. He noticed this lack of honesty, but he did not examine it too closely. They developed a routine that surprised him with how naturally it came about. She took over the cooking, not because he suggested it, but because she woke earlier than he did the first morning and had breakfast ready by the time he came in from checking on the animals, and the meal was so significantly better than what he produced for himself that neither of them made any pretense about who would cook going forward. He, in turn, brought in wood and water and broke trail and did the work that required his weight and strength, and they moved around each other in the small space of the cabin with an ease that should have been awkward, but was not. They talked constantly, not always about heavy things. Sometimes they talked about nothing at all, the behavior of a particular bird outside the window, the taste of the tea she made from dried pine needles and wild ginger, the memory of a book one or the other of them had read years ago. He had a small collection of books on the shelf beside the fireplace, not many, but chosen with care, and she had looked them over on the second morning with a quiet pleasure that he understood because he felt the same way about them. She read in the evenings while he worked on his equipment, mending harness leather and sharpening blades, the silence between them companionable and warm. Once she read aloud to him for an hour from a volume of poetry, not asking if he wanted to hear it, just beginning to read in her clear, measured voice, and he put down the knife he was sharpening and leaned back in his chair and listened and did not move until she stopped. And then he said, "Read the next one." And she did. On the 5th day, she said she needed to go back to the homestead to check on the state of it and bring back her remaining stores. And he said he would come with her, and they went together, taking Boone to carry what needed carrying. The homestead was in better shape than he had feared. The cabin was small but sturdily built. Daniel had known his way around construction at least, and the food stores, while limited, were not entirely depleted. There were beans and dried corn and salt pork and some preserved vegetables in jars, and she had a small trunk with her clothes and a few personal items, including a small framed photograph of herself and Daniel on their wedding day. She stood looking at that photograph for a long time. He loaded the stores onto Boone and did not rush her. "I'm not ready to take it down," she said. "You don't have to be," he said. She wrapped it in cloth and put it in the trunk and brought it with the rest of her things, and he understood that she was, perhaps without fully admitting it to herself, not planning to come back here. Not to live, at least. The settlement of Harlow Creek lay 6 miles down the mountain and across a river valley, a small but real town with a general store and a smithy and a church and a doctor who came through once a month from Missoula, and a saloon that served as the town's social center. Elias went there perhaps once a month for supplies and the occasional piece of news from the wider world. He had friends there of a kind, men who knew him and respected him and did not ask him too many questions, which was the category of friendship he tended to form. He took Clara down to Harlow Creek on the 8th day, partly because she needed to be seen by someone other than him, and partly because he wanted to talk to the woman who ran the boarding house, a formidable widow named Agnes Muirfield, who he trusted more than almost anyone in the valley. Agnes Muirfield was 60 years old and had come west from Virginia 20 years before with a husband who had died of cholera 6 months after their arrival, and she had simply set about building the life she was going to have with the practical ferocity of a woman who has understood that sentiment will not keep you warm. She was small and sharp-eyed and relentlessly practical, and she had no patience for nonsense, but considerable patience for people who were genuinely struggling. She took one look at Clara and put her arm around the younger woman's shoulders and steered her inside with an efficiency that suggested she had handled situations considerably more complicated than a widowed young woman in a borrowed wool coat. Elias sat in Agnes's kitchen and drank the strong tea she had left on the table and listened through the thin wall to the sound of Agnes talking quietly and Clara talking back, the sound rising and falling with the cadences of women working through a hard thing together. And he felt something in his chest that had been clenched since the moment he had found her in the snow begin, very slightly, to ease. Agnes came back into the kitchen 20 minutes later and sat across from him and looked at him with her sharp black eyes and said, "She is a good woman in a very bad situation." "Yes," he said. "She has no money." "I assumed not." "She has no family." "I know." Agnes drummed her fingers on the table. "There is a position here. I need help with the boarding house through the winter, cooking and cleaning, light work, nothing she cannot manage, in exchange for room and board." He looked at her. "That's very generous, Agnes." "It is practical," she said. "I'm not getting younger, and my back has been poor since October, and I have a gift for knowing when a person has something worth keeping in them." She paused. "She does. That girl has something worth keeping." She gave him the sharp eyes again. "You think so too, or you would have left her in the snow." He said nothing. "Elias Colt," Agnes said, with a tone that was not unkind. "You brought a woman back to your cabin who was trying to die in a snowdrift, and you have kept her there for the better part of a week, and you rode her down here on your own horse. I have known you for 4 years, and I have never seen you do anything even remotely resembling any of that. I'm not going to pretend I find it unremarkable." He picked up his tea and drank it, not because he wanted tea, but because it gave him something to do with his hands. "She is grieving," he said. "Yes," Agnes agreed, "she is. And she will be for some time. But grief and life are not mutually exclusive, and she is 22 years old, and she is sitting in my parlor right now looking at the fire with the same expression you get when you've been out in the mountains for 2 months and you finally come back to somewhere warm." He did not have an answer for that, and she was wise enough not to push further. Clara took the position with Agnes, and Elias rode back up the mountain that evening to his cabin alone, and the quietness of it was different than it had been before, though it had never been a quiet he had troubled himself about. He came down to Harlow Creek the following week to bring Agnes a side of venison and trade pelts at the general store, and he found Clara in Agnes's kitchen making apple pie from dried apples and doing it with a concentration and precision that made him stop in the kitchen doorway for a moment longer than was necessary. She looked up and saw him, and the expression on her face was, for just a moment before she composed it, one of pure and unguarded relief. "I thought you might have gone back into the high country," she said. "I don't go back up until the ice breaks in February," he said. "I told you that." "You told me a great many things," she said. "I wasn't certain how much of it I had remembered correctly." He sat at Agnes's kitchen table and watched her work, and they talked the way they had talked in his cabin, easily and without pretense, and he stayed for dinner, which Agnes managed without any apparent surprise, and then he stayed to play cards with Agnes and Clara and a neighbor named Tom Briggs who had come by to return a borrowed tool, and the evening was warm and full of firelight and the comfortable noise of people who are at ease with one another, and when he finally rode home in the dark and the cold, with Boone picking his way along the familiar trail, he was whistling. He came back the week after that, and the week after that. Agnes watched all of this with her sharp eyes and said nothing to him about it directly. But once, when he was leaving and Clara had gone to the door to tell him something she had forgotten to say inside, and he could hear them talking and laughing in the thin cold air of the doorway, Agnes, who was in the kitchen, said very quietly to no one in particular, "Well, about time something good happened." It was the deep of winter now, December and then January, and the valley was locked in cold and snow and the kind of stillness that the Bitterroot Mountains produced in winter. A silence so profound and so complete that a person could stand outside on a clear night and hear their own heartbeat. He spent considerable time at the cabin with necessary winter work, maintaining his traps, curing the hides he had taken in the fall, keeping his equipment in order, splitting enough wood to outlast the season. But he went to Harlow Creek with an honesty of purpose that he had stopped pretending to himself about, which was simply that Clara was there. She was healing. He watched it happen with a care and attention that he could not have described, but that was absolutely real. The hollow look had not come back. She cried sometimes, he knew, because Agnes told him so with a straightforwardness that he appreciated, and because once, when he had arrived earlier than expected, he had found her in the back garden of the boarding house, standing in the snow with her face turned up and her eyes wet, and he had gone very still and quiet at the garden gate until she noticed him, and when she did not try to hide the evidence of it, just said, "I was thinking about spring," with a small, complicated smile. He had said, "Spring will come," and she had said, "I know it will." And something in the way she said it was different from the voice of the woman he had found by the grave. It was the voice of someone who had decided, not without effort, that this was true and worth believing. The thing between them was building the way good things build in the mountains, slowly and without announcement, layer by layer, becoming something solid and real before either of them had put a name to it. He was not a demonstrative man. He had never been. He expressed the things he felt through action, through the cutting of a cedar cross and the riding of 6 miles through cold to bring a side of venison, and the sitting up late by someone's fire to play cards when he could have been home in his own cabin doing the dozen useful things he always had to do. She, he was coming to understand, received such expressions with a clarity and precision that meant nothing he did was missed, and she returned them in kind, in the extra food she always seemed to have ready when he arrived without announcement, and the book she had borrowed from Agnes's small collection and left on the kitchen table for him to find, and in the way she looked at him when he came through a door, that moment of unguarded relief and pleasure before she composed her face, which she never quite managed to do fast enough. It was Agnes who finally moved things forward, as Agnes frequently moved things forward, with the blunt efficiency of a woman who has no time for people dancing around what is obvious. She told them both, on a Sunday evening in late January when the three of them were sitting after supper, that she needed to go to Missoula for a week in February to deal with some business regarding a land deed, and that she was leaving Clara in charge of the boarding house, and that she expected Elias to come by daily to handle any heavy work that needed doing, and to see that nothing went wrong while she was away, and she said it in the tone she used for things that were not negotiations, and then she got up and went to bed, and Elias and Clara were left sitting by the fire looking at each other. Clara looked down at her hands in her lap. "She is not subtle," she said. "No," he agreed. "Are you going to come by daily?" she asked. "I was planning to," he said. "I come by most days as it is." She looked up at him. The fire was bright and the room was warm, and she had a small smile on her face that was not fragile and not fractured, but whole. A real smile, the kind he had been quietly hoping to see in full since the morning she had almost smiled about Boone and the corn. "Elias," she said. "Clara," he said. And they both stopped. He was sitting close to her. He had been sitting close to her for some time now, closer than was strictly necessary in a room that had room in it, the two chairs angled toward each other as they always arranged them when it was just the two of them by a fire. He could see the firelight in her dark eyes and the way a strand of her hair had come loose from its pin and lay along her cheek. "I want to say something, and I'm not certain how to say it," she began. "You're not usually uncertain about saying things," he said. "I am about this," she said, "because it feels important enough to say correctly, and I'm not entirely sure what correctly is." She looked down at her hands again, and then back up at him with a directness that he recognized as characteristic of her, the refusal to be indirect about hard things. "I came to this valley in March as Daniel's wife. I loved him. I'm not going to diminish that or apologize for it. But he is gone, and I'm still here. And I have discovered that still being here matters to me in a way that it did not when I was kneeling in the snow by his grave." She paused. "You are the reason for that, not entirely, but significantly, and I think you should know it." The fire hissed and popped. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a long, low sound like water. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, the way he had taken it that first night to rub the cold from her fingers, except that this time there was nothing of the clinical about it. He held it in both of his the way a person holds something they intend to keep. "I found you beside a grave," he said, "and I thought, this woman is not finished, and I brought you back because I was not willing for that to not be true." He paused, and he was a man who did not say things he did not mean, so when he said the next part, he said it with the same plainness he said everything else. "And I found, over the past weeks, that I am considerably less concerned about my own company than I was before I met you, which is a new experience for me." She looked at him with those dark water eyes. She was not crying. She was something beyond crying, some quiet and luminous version of herself that he suspected she had always had in her and that circumstances had not often allowed out. "That is the most romantic thing I have ever heard a man say," she said. He laughed. It came out of him like something that had been waiting, a deep, genuine sound that surprised him as much as it appeared to surprise her, and she laughed too, and the laughter between them was warm and easy and real, the laughter of two people who have been together long enough to find the same things funny. And he held her hand, and they laughed by the fire, and outside the snow fell in the dark mountains, and the world was very large and very cold, and they were very warm. He kissed her that evening, carefully, with a question in it, and she answered the question clearly and without any ambiguity, rising up from her chair slightly to make it easier, and putting her free hand against his jaw, and the kiss was warm and slow and real, nothing rushed or untethered, just honest. "I'm not entirely ready," she said when they pulled apart, and he understood exactly what she meant without elaboration. "I know," he said. "I am not asking for anything other than what you are ready for." She looked at him steadily. "But you are asking," she said, not as an accusation, just as a clarification. "Yes," he said, "I am asking." She held his gaze, and then she nodded once, a small, sure movement. "Then I'm answering." Agnes came back from Missoula in early February and took in the altered air between them with the satisfaction of a woman who has set a thing in motion and watched it arrive where she intended. She said nothing about it directly, but she started making herself scarce with a regularity that was not previously characteristic of her, and she began referring to Elias in conversation as your Elias, which was so pointed that it made Clara laugh every time. February in the Bitterroot was all deep cold and stillness, and the beginning, very subtle, of the first signs that the winter would eventually end. The days grew fractionally longer. The quality of light changed slightly, a shift in the angle of the sun that was almost imperceptible, but that a person who watched the mountains could feel, a promise of something that was not yet here, but was coming. Elias noticed it and mentioned it to Clara, and she asked him how he could possibly tell, and he said, "Look at the way the shadow falls in the meadow at noon." And the next day she stood in Agnes's doorway at noon and tilted her head and said, "I see it," with genuine delight. They went back to the grave together in February. He had made a second cross, better even than the first, with careful dovetail joints and Daniel Voss's name cut cleanly into the wood, and they carried it up the mountain together in the cold and planted it at the head of the mound, setting it deeper than the first one so that the spring thaw would not shift it. She spent a long time there, and he stood nearby, and when she was done, she took his hand on the way back down the mountain and held it the whole way. The spring moved toward them, the way spring always does in the mountains, not in a rush but in a series of small surrenders by winter, a day warm enough to go without a coat, then a week of cold again, then a morning when the creek could be heard running under the ice, then a day when the ice broke and the creek ran clear and cold and fast, and the smell of it, the clean mineral smell of mountain snowmelt, came into every building in the valley. It was April of 1875, and the world was thawing, and Elias Colt had a question he had been turning over in his mind and hands all winter, the way he turned a piece of wood before he cut it, examining it from every angle, making certain of what he was doing before the knife touched it. He asked her on a morning when they had ridden up the mountain to check the state of the homestead cabin, not because they were considering using it, but because she had wanted to see it in the spring, and they stood in the small clearing in front of it with the door open and the late April sunlight coming through the trees, and she was looking at it with an expression that was no longer painful, that was something closer to simply thoughtful. "What will you do with it?" he asked. She considered. "It is a good-built cabin. Someone could use it." "It is," he agreed. He looked at her. She was wearing her own clothes now, a good blue dress with a heavy coat over it, both purchased from the general store with the wages Agnes paid her, and her hair was up and a strand of it was loose the way it always was, because that was simply the nature of her hair. She was 22 years old, and she was standing in Montana sunlight in April, and she was alive, entirely and genuinely alive, in a way that still sometimes hit him with a force he had not anticipated when he had pulled her out of the snow 5 months before. "Clara," he said. She turned to look at him, and whatever was in his face gave her advance notice of what was coming, because her own expression shifted, went quiet and attentive. He had thought about how to do this, and had concluded that there was no particular way to improve upon simply saying it. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "Not because you need someone to provide for you, and not because you have no one else, because those are not good reasons and you deserve better than them, but because the cabin is quieter than I can tolerate now when you are not in it, and because I have not been able to read a poem in 2 months without hearing your voice doing it better than I can, and because you are the best person I have met in the Bitterroot or anywhere else, and I believe I am better at being alive when you are nearby, and I think we could build something worth building." She was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to make his heart do something uncomfortable. Then she said, "That's a very thorough answer to a question I did not ask." "I was covering the angles," he said. She took 2 steps toward him, bridging the distance between them, and took both his hands in hers and looked up at him with those dark water eyes and said, "Yes, Elias, I will marry you." He kissed her in the April sunlight with the sound of the mountain creek in the background and the smell of the thaw all around them and the cabin door standing open behind them. And it was, he thought, a satisfactory arrangement. They were married in May of 1875 in the Harlow Creek Church, a small, whitewashed building that seated perhaps 40 people and was full to capacity because it turned out that a significant portion of the valley had been watching the development of this particular situation with considerable interest and was not going to miss the resolution of it. Agnes Muirfield sat in the front row in her best black dress and cried with an unself-conscious thoroughness that impressed everyone present. Tom Briggs served as Elias's witness because they were something like friends, which for Elias was a more significant category than it was for most people. Clara wore a dress of pale cream muslin that she and Agnes had spent 3 weeks making together, and she had her hair up with a small arrangement of dried flowers from the wildflowers she had pressed the previous summer, and she was the most beautiful thing Elias had ever stood next to. He wore his best shirt and had cut his hair for the occasion, not short. It was still dark and wavy and touched the back of his collar, but trimmed and neat, and had shaved to reveal the line of his jaw. And when he turned to see her coming down the short aisle on Agnes's arm, something crossed his face that every person in the church saw, and that Agnes would describe later as the expression of a man who has suddenly understood what all the songs are about. The vows were the standard ones, the minister reading them out in the warm May afternoon with the windows of the church open and the smell of mountain spring coming in. But when Elias said, "I do," it came out of him with a weight that made it sound less like a recitation and more like a decision he had arrived at after considerable and serious thought, which was exactly what it was. They had a wedding supper at Agnes's boarding house, a real supper, roasted elk and baked bread and preserved berry pie, and the good whiskey that Tom Briggs produced from some private source and poured into tin cups. And there was music from a fiddle played by a rancher named Pete Hawkins, who turned out to have considerable talent, and dancing in Agnes's big front room with the furniture pushed back against the walls. Elias danced with Clara with the careful deliberation of a man who does not do it often, but who, when he does, applies his full attention to it. And she laughed at his seriousness, and he said, "I am not generally called upon to dance." And she said, "You are doing wonderfully." And he said, "I am highly motivated." And she laughed again, and the room was warm and bright and full of good feeling. Late in the evening, when the dancing had slowed and some of the guests had gone and the fire was lower, and Agnes had long since excused herself to bed with a pointed look that suggested she was going to remain in bed until tomorrow morning, Clara leaned against Elias's shoulder and said quietly, "I never thought it would look like this, any of this." "What did you think it would look like?" he asked. She considered. "When I was young, I thought the happy part would come first and everything else would be the challenge of keeping it. I did not understand that sometimes the challenge comes first." She looked up at him. "But this is better, I think. Knowing what something costs and choosing it anyway." He looked down at her, this woman who had come to him out of a snowstorm and a grave, this woman who had survived things that would have broken a lesser character and had come through them not hardened or diminished, but somehow clarified, more entirely herself than she might have been without the testing. "This is better," he agreed. They lived that first summer in his cabin, which was what they both preferred, and he spent considerable time in the early summer making it larger, adding a room on the east end with timber. He felled and milled himself, a real bedroom separate from the main space, and a larger storage area for the expanded provisions that 2 people required through a mountain winter. She helped where she could, and her capacity for practical work was genuine and considerable. She planted a kitchen garden in the meadow on the south side of the cabin, fencing it against deer with split rails. She hauled herself while he was working on the addition, and by August it was producing beans and squash and turnips and a brave stand of hardy potatoes that would carry them well into winter. He went out on the trap lines in the high country through July and August, the long weeks of solitary work that were as natural to him as breathing, and he came back in the evenings to the smell of supper cooking and the glow of the cabin window in the late mountain dusk, and the feeling of coming back to something did not diminish with repetition. It grew. She had taken to learning the mountains with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything else, asking him questions about the animals and the plants and the weather patterns, not casually, but with genuine attention, remembering what he told her and applying it. By the end of summer, She could read the sky for weather with reasonable accuracy, could identify the edible and medicinal plants of the region, could handle a rifle with the competent calm of someone who has been taught well and has practiced. He taught her because she asked him to, and because out here, in the Bitterroot territory of Montana, knowledge of the land was not an interesting skill but a survival matter, and she understood this and treated it accordingly. She also continued to correspond with the outside world in ways he did not, writing letters to a former neighbor in Pennsylvania, and occasionally to Daniel's sister, who had, perhaps moved by whatever complex family guilt followed the death of a younger brother, reached out to Clara in the spring and opened a tentative exchange that Clara handled with the characteristic grace she brought to difficult human negotiations. She did not hide this correspondence from Elias, and she did not make excessive drama of it either, simply keeping him informed of the content in the same matter-of-fact way she informed him of everything else. Once, that first summer, she brought up the matter of the homestead, whether they should work to have the claim transferred or simply let it lapse, and he said the decision was hers and he meant it, and she sat with it for a few days, and then said that she thought she would like to see it used rather than let it go to waste, and he helped her draft the necessary correspondence through the land office in Helena that would eventually result in the property being transferred to a young family named Calloway, who came up from Nevada in the following spring, and who Clara took immediately under her wing with the warmth of someone who understood exactly how frightening the beginning of that particular life could be. The autumn came with its characteristic magnificence, the mountain aspens going gold, and the sky going that deep October blue, and the first snows beginning on the high peaks while the valley was still green below. A year had passed since Elias had found her by the grave in the snow. He thought about this on the morning of the anniversary, an early November day with clouds building on the ridge to the north, and looked across the breakfast table at her and thought about the shape of the year, all the accumulated weight of it, the grief and the cold and the tentative beginning and the long winter and the spring and the vows in the May church and the long golden summer, and this morning with coffee and the smell of the wood fire and the sound of the wind outside. She looked up from whatever she was reading and caught him looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "A year." She understood immediately. She always understood. She set her book down and looked at him across the table with those dark water eyes and said, "We should go up today." They rode up to the grave together, taking the trail he knew by heart in all weathers, and the grave was undisturbed, and the cedar cross was still solid and true in the earth, and Clara laid a small bundle of late-season wildflowers she had gathered on the way at the base of it, and crouched there, and was quiet for a while. He stood a little apart and let her have it, this private reckoning with all that this place meant. He had thought, in the early months of their marriage, that there might be difficulty in this, in being the man who followed another man in this woman's life and in her heart, but he had discovered that his character was not built for that particular trouble. He was not jealous of a dead man or of the love that had brought Clara here in the first place, because without Daniel Voss there would have been no Clara in Montana, and without that final, desperate journey there would have been no woman in the snow on the mountain, and without the woman in the snow there would have been no Elias Colt understanding what the songs were about. The story had required all of its parts. When she stood and turned to him, her eyes were wet, but her face was steady. She took his arm, and they walked back to where Boone and her mare, a dun animal named Patience they had acquired in June, were standing in the trees. "He would have liked you," she said as they rode down. "I've thought about that." "I hope so," Elias said. "He had a good heart," she said, "and he would have recognized yours." She paused. "I think he would have been glad that I did not stay in the snow." "I am very glad you did not stay in the snow," Elias said. She reached across the distance between the two horses and took his hand where it rested on the saddle horn and held it for a moment before the trail narrowed and she had to let go. The winter of 1875 into 1876 was easier than the previous one, not because it was milder, but because they went into it well prepared and well provisioned and together, which made an enormous difference. Clara had proven to be an exceptional organizer of household resources, the skill of a woman who had grown up managing her family's store accounts, and the cabin stores going into winter were the best Elias had ever laid in, sorted and cataloged and sufficient to last until April with careful management. He had added a small separate storage house beside the main cabin in October, built tight against animals and weather, and it held smoked venison and elk, dried beans and corn, preserved vegetables, salt, flour, and the other essentials of mountain winter survival in quantities that he found obscurely reassuring. Agnes came up to the cabin in early December for a 3-day visit, making the journey with Elias as escort on a clear, cold day. And she arrived and looked around at everything Clara had done with the place and said, "Well, you have improved this considerably," with a satisfaction that made Clara laugh. Agnes and Clara had maintained something between a friendship and a quasi-familial bond from the previous winter, corresponding regularly when apart and falling easily into each other's company when together, and watching them together in the cabin, talking over tea and mending and generally taking over every surface of his main room with the domestic efficiency of women who know exactly what they are doing, gave Elias a feeling of rich and settled happiness that he stored away in the way he stored provisions, carefully and with awareness of its value. It was during this winter that Clara told him she was expecting. She told him on a January morning when he had just come in from the cold, and he stopped with snow still on his coat and looked at her, and the look on her face told him this was real and certain before the words did. He crossed the room and took her face in both his hands the way he had held her cold hands that first night, and he looked at her with an expression that he was aware was probably embarrassing in its transparency, and he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said, and she was smiling, really smiling, the full version of it, and her eyes were bright. He kissed her forehead, and then her mouth, and then he held her against him with his arms around her in the middle of the cabin while the fire burned in the great stone fireplace, and outside the snow fell on the mountains, and he thought that whatever else the Bitterroot had taken and given back over the years, it had never given him anything like this. The spring of 1876 came with all its usual drama and beauty, the snow retreating up the peaks as the valley thawed and the meadow creek rose and ran fast and clear, and the first green things pushed up through the wet ground with the insistence of things that have been waiting a long time. Clara moved through the pregnancy with the practical calm she brought to most things, making adjustments as they became necessary, and accepting help where it was genuinely needed, which she was improving at, she admitted, because it had not always come naturally to her to ask for help. He fussed over her in the only way he knew how, which was to be continuously aware of anything that required physical effort and to simply perform it before she could attempt it, and she allowed this with a fond exasperation that was one of his favorite of her expressions, the one where she looked at him with one eyebrow slightly raised and said, "Elias, I'm expecting a child not made of glass," and he said, "I know that," and then carried the water anyway. Agnes came up to the cabin in June to be there for the birth, arriving a full week before the expected time because she had a sensible understanding of how unpredictable such things were, and the cabin in that week of waiting was full of the particular kind of warm female energy that Elias Colt, a man who had spent years largely alone in the mountains, found both entirely bewildering and obscurely wonderful. The child was born on a July morning in 1876, in the year of the nation's centennial, and came into the world with considerable vigor and volume. It was a boy, solid and dark-haired with his father's brow and his mother's dark water eyes, and he screamed his opinion of the whole process from the first breath with an authority that made Agnes laugh and made Clara say, exhausted and incandescent, "He is loud," and made Elias, sitting on the edge of the bed with the baby in his arms after Agnes had wrapped him, look down at this small, fierce person and experience something so enormous and wordless that he could not have expressed it in any language he possessed. They named him Thomas Daniel Colt. The Thomas was for no one in particular because they both liked the sound of it, and the Daniel was for the man under the cedar cross on the mountain because it seemed right, and because Clara wanted it, and because Elias agreed without hesitation. Agnes stayed 3 weeks after the birth, which was longer than she had planned, but which she justified to herself on the grounds that Clara needed the help, which was partly true, and that she herself found the company of a new baby in a house deeply pleasant, which was entirely true. When she finally returned to Harlow Creek, she left behind a comprehensive set of instructions about infant care written in her small, precise hand, which Clara read carefully once and then referred to approximately never, because she turned out to be, as with most things she applied herself to, a natural. Young Thomas Daniel Colt was a person of strong opinions from the beginning. He had his father's constitution, sturdy and self-sufficient, and his mother's intelligence and expressiveness, and he combined them in ways that kept both parents continuously entertained and occasionally challenged. By 8 months, he was pulling himself upright on whatever furniture was within reach, and regarding everything around him with an attention that was clearly the beginning of serious interest in how the world worked. By the time the winter of 1876 into 1877 arrived, they were 3 in the cabin, and the cabin, with its added room and the careful organization Clara had imposed on every inch of its storage, was adequate but growing cozier. And Elias began, in the quieter moments of that winter, to think about building on further. He drew plans in the evenings on the back of old packing paper, spreads of rooms that grew gradually more ambitious as the winter went on, and Clara, nursing the baby in her chair by the fire, would glance over at what he was drawing and say things like, "If you are going to add a room, you should add 2. And he would say, "That is what I am doing," and she would say, "Good." The life they built over the following years in the Bitterroot had the quality of something that grew naturally from its roots, expanding and deepening without losing its essential character. Elias continued to run his trap lines through the seasons, ranging the high country with the freedom that was as fundamental to him as breathing. And Clara continued to develop her own knowledge of the land and her own relationship with the valley community, taking on a quiet but significant role in the small society of Harlow Creek as one of the people to whom others turned in difficulty. Agnes called her the one with the good sense, which was a very specific category of compliment from Agnes. In 1878, a second child came, a girl they named Ruth. She had her father's height from the first, stretching herself long and lean in her cradle with an air of confident authority, and she adored her older brother with a ferocity that Thomas, now 2 years old and thoroughly himself, handled with the tolerant good humor of a boy who had always been secure in his position. In the spring of 1878, there was a period of considerable difficulty when Elias was out on the high trap lines, and a man arrived in Harlow Creek who had some troubled history with the territory and who caused alarm in the community by his behavior and manner. Agnes wrote to Clara about it with her usual economy, and Clara handled it by doing what she had learned to do in 2 years of valley life, which was to assess the situation clearly and act on the assessment. She took the children to Agnes's boarding house, sent word through the valley telegraph of concerned neighbors, and waited for Elias to come down from the mountain. He came down as soon as he received word, 3 days after it arrived at the trapline camp, making the descent in a single hard day that required Boone to cover ground at a pace that the mule found personally objectionable. The situation resolved without direct confrontation, the man in question departing the valley under the collective pressure of a community that had decided he was not welcome. But the episode sharpened Elias's awareness of the limits of his protection when he was 4 days' ride away. He and Clara talked about it that night at their kitchen table, the children asleep in the new bedroom he had added the previous year, the fire low and the mountain night quiet around the cabin. "I do not regret the trap lines," he said, "but I need to know you were safe when I'm away." "I was safe," she said. "I handled it." "You did," he agreed. He meant it without qualification. He had never made the mistake of underestimating what she was capable of. "But I would like to know that in the general case, not just the specific one." They talked about it for a long time, going over every practical angle the way they went over every significant decision together, with equal weight given to each person's view. The conclusion they arrived at was that they would get a dog, a large and serious one, and that Clara would get better instruction with the rifle, and that he would organize his long trips into the high country around the seasons when the community was most active, and neighbors were closer, which was the summer months. He got the dog the following week, a young male cattle dog with a gray coat and a watchful intelligence that Clara immediately named Corporal, which Elias found excessively dignified for an 8-month-old dog, but which turned out to suit the animal's character perfectly. Corporal took up his position in the Colt household with the gravity of a creature who understood his responsibilities and intended to meet them, and he and Clara developed a working relationship of mutual respect that was, Elias thought, not entirely unlike his own working relationship with Clara. The 1870s turned into the 1880s with the particular swift weight of years that are full of things. The cabin became a proper house over those years, room by room, with real glass windows he brought up from Missoula in 1879, and a proper wood floor to replace the packed earth in 1880, and a second fireplace in the new back room in 1881. The kitchen garden became a serious kitchen garden, expanded and refined each year, supplying not just their own table, but enough preserved goods to share with neighbors in lean seasons and to sell a modest surplus through Agnes's boarding house. Thomas at 6 was a boy who reminded Elias sometimes, with a sweetness that caught him off guard, of himself at that age, before the restlessness had set in, serious and observant and comfortable in the outdoors in the way of a child who's been shown it with love. He began going out with his father to check the nearest trap lines in the fall of 1882, old enough to walk the trails without difficulty, and Elias felt in those mornings the same quality of transmission that old Heck had given him, the knowledge of the mountains passing from one person to the next in the language of direct experience. Ruth at 4 was a person of absolutely devastating determination and considerable charm, and she managed both characteristics with a skill that Clara said was suspiciously practiced for someone her age. She had gotten her father's size, which on a 4-year-old girl expressed itself as a general solidity and a physical confidence, and her mother's quickness of mind, and she was, by consensus of everyone who encountered her, a force. Agnes Moorfield, now well into her 60s, came up to the Colt house for Christmas of 1881 and did not go back. This was not a dramatic event. She simply arrived in December, and the days passed and February came and went, and she was still there, occupying the small room at the back of the new addition with Corporal installed at the foot of her bed, in defiance of whatever objections anyone might have raised. And eventually, it was simply understood that Agnes lived there. She was useful, considerably more useful than her increasingly arthritic hands, and occasionally bad back would suggest she should be. And she was family, which was what she was in everything that mattered. The boarding house in Harlow Creek she transferred formally to its longtime resident caretaker, a quiet man named Howard Peck, who had been running it practically on his own for 2 years anyway, in the spring of 1882, and she invested the proceeds with the financial acumen that had kept her solvent through 3 decades of Western life, in a modest but reliable arrangement that meant she was not dependent on anyone for her comfort. She told Clara, while they were sitting in the kitchen one evening in early 1882 with the children in bed, and the sound of Elias in the back room going over his accounts, "I was alone for a very long time, and I chose it, and I do not regret it. But I find that I prefer this. I find that given the option between being entirely self-sufficient and being in a house with good people who are kind, I prefer the house." Clara said, "I am very glad you are here, Agnes." Agnes said, "I know you are, dear. That is partly why it works." There were harder seasons within the good ones, because that is the nature of life in the Bitterroot and life in general. There was a winter in 1883 when the elk population was low and the trapping was poor and money was genuinely tight, and they got through it on the strength of their stores and the mutual aid of the valley community, which had always operated on the understanding that bad years hit everyone and that the way to survive them was collectively. There was a summer when the creek flooded and took out part of the garden and half the fence, and Elias spent a week in the water doing the work of rebuilding it while Clara managed everything else, and they were short-tempered with each other for about 3 days in the middle of it, and then had the kind of honest conversation that clears the air completely and came out the other side closer than before. There was a day in 1884 when Elias came down from the high country with an injury to his right arm from a trap chain accident, not unlike the one that had given him the scar on his jaw years before, and the injury was significant enough to need more than his own management of it. Clara cleaned and bound it with the competent calm of someone who has handled enough of life's physical emergencies to have gotten over any squeamishness, and she sat up most of the night beside the bed, watching for the fever that sometimes followed such injuries. And when he woke in the night and found her there, she said, "Go back to sleep," in a voice that brooked no argument, and he did. The arm healed cleanly. He had, she told him afterward, given her 3 days of serious worry, and he should in the future be more careful with trap chains, and he said he would try, and she said, "Trying is not good enough when the alternative is me spending 3 nights watching for a fever." And they looked at each other with the full force of mutual knowledge that was built from a decade of shared life, and he took her hand and said, "I will be more careful." And she said, "Good." And that was that. It was in the autumn of 1884 that Clara stood at the window of their bedroom in the early morning and watched the first snow of the season coming down on the peaks and felt the particular quality of peace that had been, 10 years ago in a Pennsylvania kitchen, entirely beyond her imagining. The life she had now was nothing like the life she had planned. It was harder and stranger and richer and more real than anything she had projected from the safe distance of the East, and the love at the center of it was of a kind she had not known existed, the kind built not from the first bright fire of romance, but from the 10,000 acts of choosing each other that preceded every morning like this one. Elias came up behind her in the early light, enormous and warm and smelling of coffee, and put his arms around her from behind and looked out the window with her at the snow on the peaks. "First snow," he said. "Yes," she said. "Winter will be good this year," he said. "I can feel it." She leaned back against him and looked at the mountains they had both chosen and said, "Yes, I think it will." Thomas was 9 that autumn, and in the evenings he was increasingly inclined to sit at the table with his parents after supper and listen to the conversations that went on there, the planning and the accounting and the discussions about the valley and the territory and the broader world that drifted in with newspapers that came up from Missoula. He asked good questions, specific and genuinely curious, and they answered them with the same seriousness they brought to each other's questions, because that was the only way they knew how to treat a person regardless of age. Ruth at 6 was already reading with a fluency that astonished everyone who did not know her mother, and was working her way through the books on the cabin shelf with a systematic determination that Elias recognized as his own approach to every skill he had ever tried to acquire. Agnes was teaching her sums in the mornings while Clara was in the garden or at other work, and the two of them had a relationship of enormous mutual esteem that Agnes expressed by pretending to find Ruth's inevitable questions about everything slightly exasperating, and Ruth expressed by sitting as close to Agnes as possible whenever they were in the same room. Life in the Bitterroot in the mid-1880s was changing in ways both large and small. The territory was filling in. Harlow Creek had grown to something approaching a real town, with a school now and a second store and a physician who came once a week instead of once a month. The railroad had come through to the south, which made Missoula more accessible and meant that goods and news moved faster than they once had. There was more law in the territory, which was on balance a good thing, though it changed the nature of the place in ways that Elias regarded with the complicated feelings of a man who had arrived when the country was genuinely raw and had both loved and survived that rawness. He talked to Clara about it on a fall evening in 1885, sitting on the porch he had added to the east side of the house that summer. The mountains were beginning to go gold, and the air had that particular September clarity that made every edge sharp and every color deep and true. "It is not what it was when I came here," he said. "Is that a loss?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "Some of it is. The quiet was real. The space was real. You could go 3 months without seeing another person, and it was not unusual." He paused. "But the loneliness was real, too. I did not know how real until it was different." She looked at him. "I think you were already ready for something different when I found you," she said, "or when you found me. I think the loneliness had done what it needed to do and you were ready for the next part. You just needed a reason to know that." He thought about this. A woman freezing beside a grave in a snowstorm is a fairly dramatic reason. She smiled. It was the full smile, warm and alive and entirely her own. "I have never done anything quietly," she said. He laughed, the deep, genuine laugh that she had been pulling out of him since the first winter, and put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch in the September evening with the mountains going gold and the sound of the children inside and Agnes's voice telling one of them to come away from that, and Corporal, now gray around the muzzle but still utterly dignified, asleep on the porch boards at their feet. The third child came in 1886, another boy, James Warren Colt, a surprise in the very best sense of the word. He arrived in June with his mother's dark eyes and a disposition that was, from the first weeks of his life, notably more serene than his older siblings, as though he had registered the general energy level of the household and decided that equanimity was his contribution. Thomas, now 11, took on a big brother role with James, with a gentleness that caught both his parents off guard, and that Clara later said had always been there in him, waiting for the right occasion. Ruth, 8 years old and already the household's most authoritative presence outside of Agnes, supervised everything having to do with the baby, with a seriousness that made the baby, when he was old enough to be supervised, look up at her with an expression of absolute trust that was one of the most charming things any of them had ever seen. The years of a family's life do not always summarize neatly because they are made of days, and each day is its own thing, its particular quality of light and its specific difficulties and its small moments of grace. There was the morning Thomas came home from the trail with his first proper catch on his own lines and the expression on his face, 15 years old, and trying very hard not to look as proud as he was, and the way Elias had looked at him and said simply, "Good work," which was high praise in the Colt household, and Thomas knew it. There was the evening Ruth at 12 wrote out a letter to the territorial newspaper in Missoula, objecting to something she had read in its pages, and sent it without telling anyone. And 3 weeks later, the letter was printed, and Clara read it at the kitchen table with an expression of surprised delight, and passed it to Elias without comment, and he read it and looked up at his daughter and said, "That's a very well-reasoned argument," and Ruth tried not to show how much that pleased her, and failed entirely. There was the spring of 1887, when Agnes turned 72, and they had a supper for her, just the family, with her favorite foods, and one of the bottles of good wine Elias had brought up from Missoula for the occasion, and Agnes, who was not a sentimental woman, looked around the table at the people she had spent the last 6 years living among and said, "I have had a good life. I want that noted." Everyone noted it, and it was true. Agnes died in the winter of 1889, quietly in her sleep in her room at the back of the house, with Corporal at the foot of her bed and the mountain cold outside and the fire low in the grate. She was 74 years old, and she had been in gentle decline for several months, though she had resisted any characterization of this that implied inconvenience to anyone else with the ferocity she brought to every resistance. Clara sat with her the last night. She had known it was close, and she had not left Agnes's side, and she was there when the old woman slipped away in the early hours of a January morning, and she held Agnes's hand through it, and was glad she was there, and let herself cry after, alone in the kitchen with the fire she had built up for warmth, for a full hour before the children were awake. They buried Agnes in the Harlow Creek Cemetery, in a plot beside the church on a gray January day, with snow coming, and the town turned out with a completeness that was a testimony to a life fully and generously lived. Clara stood at the grave with Elias's hand in hers and his arm against her arm, and thought about the first grave she had stood at in these mountains, the one in the snow on the mountainside, and about all the distance between then and now, and she thought that Agnes Muirfield, who had taken a hollow young widow in from the cold and given her purposeful work in the beginnings of a path forward, was owed a considerable debt that could never be repaid, but could be honored by the way a person went on living. She honored it in that way, which was the only way available. Corporal outlasted Agnes by 8 months, which seemed to all of them entirely appropriate, and when he died in the autumn of 1889, they buried him at the edge of the meadow beside the cabin, and young James, 3 years old, left a stone there that he had chosen himself from the creek bed, which became a permanent marker. The 1890s brought changes to the Bitterroot and to the Colt household with the steady inevitability of all things growing and shifting. Thomas, by 1892, was 17 and had his father's height and his mother's dark eyes and was in the process of becoming someone, the outline of an adult emerging from the boy the way the mountains emerged from the morning mist. He was spending more time in Harlow Creek, drawn by the social gravity that pulls young people toward each other, and had made friendships there that Clara watched with the particular pleasure of a mother who has raised someone worth knowing and is watching the world begin to recognize it. Ruth at 14 was brilliant and knew it, and was managing this knowledge with varying degrees of success, which Clara took as entirely normal for a 14-year-old of her intelligence, and said so when Elias, somewhat concerned, brought it to her attention. "She is going to be a remarkable person," Clara said. "She already is," he agreed. "She's also occasionally exhausting." "She comes by it honestly," Clara said, and he looked at her and she looked back at him, and they both managed to keep straight faces for approximately 3 seconds. James at 6 was the household's peace. He had an equanimity that neither of his parents could entirely account for, and that the family had come to rely on in the way they relied on the spring creek as a constant and steady presence. He was deeply attached to the natural world in the specific way of a child who has grown up at its edge, and he could spend hours in the meadow or at the creek, watching and learning with a patient attention that reminded Elias, with a wave of quiet feeling, of himself. It was in the spring of 1892, 17 years after Elias had found Clara in the snow, that they stood together on the mountain by the Cedar Cross, at the same time of year they had stood there the previous spring, and many springs before that. The grave was well tended, as it always was. The cross was still solid, though the wood had weathered to a deep silver gray with the years. Clara had brought wildflowers from the first flush of the meadow, yellow and white, and she arranged them at the base of the cross with a care that was the same as it had always been, each spring's revisiting carrying all the previous ones with it. She stood and was quiet for a while, and Elias stood beside her in the spring light with the mountains around them and the valley below going green with the season, and he thought about the young woman he had found here 17 years before, the hollow, freezing, desperate young woman who had said, "I know," when he told her she was going to die. And he thought about who she was now, fully and completely herself, mother and neighbor, and the person in this valley that people trusted with their troubles. Woman of the mountains who knew the sky and the plants and the trails, as well as many men who had spent their whole lives here. "He would not know me," she said at last. "No," Elias agreed, "but I think he would be glad." She turned to look at him, the spring light in her dark eyes, 40 years old in this anniversary year, and she was still the most beautiful thing he had ever stood next to, and he knew this was not an objective assessment, and he did not care. "I think so too," she said. "I think he would look at all of this," she gestured, "the mountains, the valley, him, herself, and he would say, 'Good. This is good.'" Elias took her hand. She looked at their clasped hands, and then at his face, with the expression he had come to know as well as his own breathing, the direct, luminous, unguarded expression that she had been allowing him to see since the first winter, and that he had never once taken for granted. "It is good," he said. She leaned into him briefly, her shoulder against his arm, and they stood like that in the mountain spring with the sound of the wind in the high spruce and the distant sound of the creek below, and everything was quiet and true and whole. Thomas came to his father in the summer of 1893 and told him there was a girl in Harlow Creek. Her name was Eliza Harper, the daughter of a rancher who had come up from Wyoming, and she was 17 and Thomas was 18, and he described her with the bewildered reverence of a young man for whom the world has just rearranged itself. Elias listened to all of this with considerable patience, and when Thomas was done, said, "Bring her to supper." Clara, when informed, said, "I know," which Thomas found disconcerting and his parents found entertaining. Eliza Harper came to supper and was a person of good sense and warm character who managed Ruth, who was 16, and testing everyone around her with the systematic thoroughness of a scientist, with a cheerful directness that impressed the whole family and won over Agnes's empty chair at the table in the way that only the right person can win over a space left by someone irreplaceable. Clara liked her immediately, and she liked Clara immediately, and Elias watched this with quiet satisfaction. Ruth went to school in Missoula in 1895, which had been the plan discussed in the family for 2 years, because the school in Harlow Creek had taken her as far as it could, and she was ready for more. She went with a carpetbag of books and her mother's organization skills and her father's stubbornness, and she thrived there, with the relentless thoroughness that had always characterized her approach to things she cared about. She came home for Christmas and in the summers, and she wrote letters regularly, letters full of the ideas she was encountering and her opinions of them. And the kitchen table conversations when she was home had an additional charge of argument and exploration that the whole family, if they were honest, loved. Thomas and Eliza were married in the summer of 1896 in the same Harlow Creek church where Elias and Clara had married 21 years before, and the Colt family sat in the pews with the cumulative weight of a life built together, Elias and Clara side by side where they always were, and James at 10 in his good shirt watching his brother stand at the front of the church with the earnest hope of a boy who believes in things, and Ruth, home from Missoula for the occasion, sitting with a composed dignity that fooled no one about how much she was moved. In the autumn of 1896, with the world settled into itself and the good life established in all its dimensions, Elias and Clara sat on their east porch in the September evening that was very like a September evening 22 years before, and the mountains were going gold and the air was clear and cool, and he still had his arm around her, and she still leaned into him, and they looked at the peaks together. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He thought about the honest answer, which was that he was thinking about the shape of everything, all of it from the beginning, the finding and the saving and the long, slow fall, and the building and the children and the losses and the joy, the full weight and measure of a life shared. "I am thinking that the day I found you in the snow was the best day of my life," he said, "though I could not have told you that at the time." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was trying to die." "I know," he said, "and you picked me up anyway." "Yes." She turned to look at him, the full face of her, the dark water eyes, and the years in them, and the life and the love that he had learned was not one thing, but all things together, accumulated day by day, steady as the spring creek and as fundamental. "Thank you for being very stubborn," she said. He smiled, the slow, full smile that he did not give easily, and that she, from the very beginning, had always been able to produce. "Thank you for staying warm," he said. She laughed, and he held her, and the mountains were gold, and the evening was long and clear, and the world stretched out ahead of them into a future they did not need to see to trust, because they had already built the thing that made the future real. James called from inside the house about something, and Clara called back, and Elias stood and held his hand out to her, and she took it, and he pulled her up. And they went inside together, into the warm and the light, into the life that had been built from a moment of terrible cold and a stubborn refusal to let the cold win, into all the good years that were still ahead. The Bitterroot Mountains stood above it all as they had always stood, indifferent and magnificent and permanent, and below them in the small meadow, the cabin that had grown into a house held its light against the dark, warm and full and entirely alive.